Hey guys, it's Little Black Belt here with C++ for Beginners tutorial number 8. We've come a long way so far, but there's still a long ways to go. Today we're going to be talking about functions, which are a huge part in programming, and they can be really useful. And I'm going to show you different types of functions and what you can use them for. So functions are basically a piece of code, a block of code that you decide, and basically you give it a name, and whenever you use that function name, the computer will execute the code that you give to that function. Might sound a little tricky now, but it's really simple, and I'll show you all the details in a minute. So, you've already seen a function. If you've been watching my C++ tutorials before, you know that this is how we start our C++ programs. And int main here is actually a function, okay? So everything that you put in main, you're saying this is what I want the computer to execute when I call main, okay? So, I have a little note over here. So functions, they have a return type, okay? The return type is noted before the function name. As you can see, main has a return type of int, which means it returns an integer number, and as you can see, 0, it does return an integer number. May or may not have a return statement. So sometimes functions don't have a return statement, and those are a different type of functions called void functions. They can have a return statement, but they cannot actually return a value. So this is returning 0, but the return also indicates the end of the function and will quit the function, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to return a value all the time. So if you just write return in a function that is typeless, also known as void, then it will exit that function. And I will show an example of that in a second. As I said, they're used to execute a piece of code. They're helpful if the code needs to be executed several times. So instead of writing that entire block, you can just write one line. You just write that function name. And they may or may not have parameters, and I will get into what parameters are in a second. So right now, let's make a function that adds two integers together. Okay? Now, typically what I like to do is write the function, the definition of the function below main, and then write what's called a function prototype above main. And so what that does is when you have the compiler go through and look at your C++ file, it's going to say, okay, we are expecting this function up here, and it's called, whatever you call it, and it returns this type. And so we're looking out for that function later. So that's what I like to do. I like to write a prototype up here and the declaration down here. And we'll get into what that means in a second. But if we want to, let's say we want to make a function that adds two numbers and returns the sum of that number. Okay? Let's make so we know we're adding two integers, we're always going to get an integer. So let's make it an int type, and we're going to call it add. Alright? Int add. And for right now, we're going to take no parameters. And then we're going to write what we want it to do inside this function, okay? So let's say we have an int a and b, okay? And we want to ask the user what those are. So enter numbers for a and b. And then let's see in a, C and B. Okay? And now let's return A plus B. Okay? So that's going to return the sum from this function. And also, what I mentioned before, return value will quit that function and will also pass this value out. And it's expecting an integer value. This type must match this type. This can't say int and return a float. Okay? It's got or a string or something else. It has to be the same type that this return type is up here, okay? So now we've told the computer what this function does. We have to tell the compiler to look out for it. So up here, I usually like to leave a couple spaces. We're just going to say int add, okay? And that just says there's a function with a return type add that takes 0 parameters, okay? I'm sorry, there's a function with return type int called add that has no parameters, okay? And now we want to execute that function within main. All we have to do is type add, and that whole thing is going to execute. This whole thing will execute on this one line. Okay? Let's compile it and check it out. And it's going to ask us to save it. Let's call it new.cpp. Let's see if it gives us any problems here, and it doesn't. So let's go to our command prompt. I apologize for not having this open earlier. Okay, and I called it new. Let's run it. Enter numbers for A and B. Let's do 5 and 3. Okay, so some of that should be 8. And it doesn't. That's so stupid. Okay, so I forgot to see out that. Now it should actually print it to the screen. I promise you it did add them, it just didn't print them. So that was really not a good 6. And there we go. Let's do it again. Try with 5 and 3 again. 5 and 3. It's C out 8. So as you can see, we've returned it and we've printed it to the screen. And another thing we could also do, which you should know how to do this, we can say an int, let's say int A. We can call this A because of this thing called scope. Okay, so we already have this integer A declared here. Okay, we can make an integer A in main because it's outside of what we call the scope of this function. So basically, when this function quits, the computer forgets all about this A, and we can write this. We can write a new A here. Okay, so int A, and then we can say A gets add. Okay, so this is returning a type integer and assigning that return value to A. So A is going to become whatever this is, and then we can simply see out A like that. Let's do that. Let's say 5 and 3 again. And the same input, minus that extra end line, because I took it out. So yeah, now you can see the return type integer. Okay, it's getting returned there. But let's say A and B, the numbers we want to add, already exist in main. And we want to pass them this function, add them, and then pass them back out. We can do that, but we have to get rid of this. Okay? And this. I mean, we wouldn't have to get rid of that, but I'd like to have the user enter those values inside main. So let's declare them here. Int A and B. Okay? Let's say enter numbers for A and B. B. There we go. And C and A. C and B. Should have probably just copied and pasted those from the other function, but I didn't think about it. And we'll run this function, which won't do anything right now. And just for demonstration purposes, I'll show you another example of scope and something else interesting about functions. We need to change this though, because we want A and B to get passed into this add function. So let's tell it that we're going to give it 2 parameters, is what it's called. 2 parameters that we're passing into the function. So if we give it these 2 parameters and say that this function is always expecting 2 integer numbers, then every time you run this function, you have to give it 2 integer numbers. No more, no less, and it has to be integers as well if you tell it integers. So we'll say int 1, int 2, okay, just the variable names 1 and 2. Actually, we can call them x and y. That'd be a better, more straightforward name for them. X and y, okay? Now, we're passing A and B. And I could also call these numbers A and B too. However, for demonstration purposes, I'd like to show you that you can call them whatever you want. Just know that X and Y correspond to A and B, okay? Whatever you put in for the X slot, as you can see, the X comes first. If we put A first, then every X in this function corresponds to A. And since B is in the second spot, then Y corresponds to B, okay? So, let's just add them. We can just say return X plus Y. Okay, and that's still going to return the same thing. Remember, X is A, Y is B. And I could have called them A and B, but you can name them anything you want because of scope. Again, it's basically creating new space in memory for these two variables and returning it. It doesn't matter what you call them, but just remember the variable in the first spot always corresponds to this variable. It's also in the first spot, so the order does matter. We also need to change the prototype up here. Say int and int. You only need to write the type that the function is expecting. You don't need to have any names for them. You just need to write the type up here. Okay. Down here you need to write the variable names. I know it can get a little confusing, but that's just the way it is. You just have to memorize it. Okay. In here, since we already declared a and b as ints, you can just write a and b. Same thing with here, x and y, because we've already declared x and y. Let's run this, and it should have the same functionality. Actually, we can just see out add ab so we can see it printed to the screen again. So don't forget to do that. And we should get the same exact functionality if we put the same exact numbers. So we'll try 5 and 3 just as before. We can see it still gives us 8. Okay, so that's another way to do it, is passing in via parameters. Parameters are going to be really important, and a lot of functions that you're going to write are going to take in parameters, and a lot of them aren't. Now, I mentioned that there is a type of function that does not have a type. Okay, there is a function type that is typeless. It's a little confusing, but that is actually called void. Okay, a void function is usually used for something easy. You don't have to store values, really, like printing things to the screen. If you wanted to print something to the screen, you could use a void function to do it. I'm just going to get rid of this function, get rid of this function. What the heck is that? I have no idea what that is. Get rid of this function and get rid of everything inside main. And we're going to just start fresh, okay? So let's give ourselves another scenario here. Let's say we want to print the numbers 0 through 9 to the screen using a for loop, and we went over for loops before. Okay, that's not too bad, right? We could do that inside main, but we're going to make a function for it. Since we're only printing to the screen, we don't need a return type. We only need it printed, so we could have a function type called void. That's the return type is void. I'm going to say void print nums. Okay, and we don't need to pass it any parameters, but you could, and the process for that is the exact same thing I just showed you. Okay, print nums. We also need the prototype up here. We need to say that it's a void, and we need to say the name, print nums, and there's no parameters, so we don't need to say any of those. Another thing you should note is the semicolon up here versus the brackets here. Okay, that's just another thing you got to memorize how that works. Now let's use a for loop to print these numbers to the screen. So say int I gets 0, okay? I less than, we said 0 through 9, so we got to do less than 10. I plus plus to increment it each time. And we only need one line after this, so let's see out I. And let's give it an endl after each line, so it'll give it a return after each line. And now we just need to run that inside main and say print nums. There. So this will run this. We still need that function prototype, okay? Let's run that. There we go. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Perfect, right? Stopped right before 10. We wanted 0 through 9, and it printed it. Okay, so, and you notice I didn't return anything, right? But I could return, right? If I wanted to, let's say I just wanted to stop this after, like, I don't know, after we did 0. We wanted to cut it short, okay? So that's what we'll do. We will just add a return here. Okay, but we can't return a value because it's void. You can't do that. So we're just going to return. So all this is going to do is print 0, right? It's going to stop after that because we're returning. And as I said, this return function is going to quit out of the, this return statement is going to quit out of the function the minute the statement encounters it. Okay? And since it's inside the for loop, it's going to get through one iteration and then stop. So it should only print 0. Let's try it. new, 0 and quit, okay? And encounter the return function and it quit. But just note that it's not returning a value because of this type void. It cannot pass a value from a function, okay? And you can have function types be any type in C++, okay? And then when we get to user-defined types, so like structs or classes, you can even have functions that return those as well, okay? So you get a lot of functionality, and functions are really, really important in programming, something that you need to have down, okay? So I showed you parameters, I showed you return types, I showed you return statements, function prototypes up here. The other way that you could do this if you didn't want to use function prototypes is what you could do is just move this whole function. Let's take this return statement out because there's no need for it. You take this whole function, we can cut it and paste it above main, and because the compiler encounters this entire function, there's no need to put a prototype and give it a heads up since it's before main. I'll show you that. And we have the same functionality as before, okay? But main is the most important function in your program. I like to have it at the top. That's why I put the prototypes, the one-line prototypes, rather than the whole function, because programs can get pretty long. I've had programs I've written myself, well over 1,000 lines of code, and you're going to want to make sure that you have main right up there at the top so that you see what's going on. It's just a personal preference, really. It's my personal preference. I like to write the prototypes and the definitions down below. Yes, it is a little bit more writing, but I think it's easier in the end for other people to read as well. So, and another thing, if you write some function but you don't tell it what to do, the compiler is going to say, wait, what? There's no print nums function. We don't know what this does. I'll show you that. You'll notice it's going to be an error. In function int main error, print nums was not declared in this scope. Okay, that's saying it has no idea what print nums is because we did not define it or tell it to expect this function at all. So that's just really easy. Functions, they're not too hard to learn, but it's definitely crucial because you're not going to always want to have all your code just sitting in main. If you saw the calculator video I did last, all the code was in main because I had not taught functions yet. But now we could have functions like add nums, subtract nums, that kind of stuff. Okay, and you can name the functions anything you want. You could call them butt crack if that's what you wanted to do, you know. But it's a little more helpful to name them something that has to do with what they actually do. So, well, that's it for today's tutorial, guys. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. Check out my recent gameplay videos or past C++ tutorials. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, make sure you drop a like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later. Thanks.